I thought I'd give you some tips today on public speaking and talk to you about some of the things to think about as you're making a presentation, whether it's an opening statement, a closing argument, or whether or not you're making an argument to the court. Obviously, public speaking is a very personal thing, and it's one of the things to make sure that we start by saying is that my tips to you are not to turn you into somebody else. But the tips that I'm offering you are designed to try to give you a chance to be the authentic you, to be the best that you can be. When you think about public speaking and all of the early impressions that you make of someone when they stand up in front of you, there are a number of things that I can give you and suggest to you and show you during the next few minutes that will give you suggestions about how it is to control your adrenaline, how to control your breath, and how it is that you can control to make sure that you're the best that you can be as a public speaker. It's important to realize that your introductory perspective on public speaking is often shaped by early experiences in debate and in perhaps the encouragement that you got to get into being a lawyer in the first place. Folks, friends of yours may have said to you, you know, I think you really enjoy public speaking. You get that buzz, you get that adrenaline lift from being up on your feet. I think you ought to be a lawyer. Or it could be that during debate, folks recognize that you are very facile, you're quick on your feet, you're thinking quickly, and you can change gears. But there are a couple of things about those early experiences that encourage people in public speaking that we've got to also be careful about. And a couple of those things that you have to be careful about are that when you're making your public pitch, things that may have worked in a debate setting or with exchanges with friends are often not the right mindset to have when you're trying to talk to a jury or to talk to an audience. The tricks that you had when you were a kid in debating somebody else were as follows. You would try to talk over the top of the person who was talking to try to take control. The pace of your speech was often very, very rapid so that the person couldn't get in an argument edgewise. If you were in trouble, you'd go on the attack. You would strike out. You would make personal attacks on the person that you were talking to. And those habits are deeply ingrained. When I watch young lawyers do public speaking very often, you'll see a lawyer who is too shrill, who is too fast in the speech, is too quick to switch topics because they're feeling like they're in trouble. And the kind of speech that we're talking about is a kind of speech that will take the time to help the audience come to a place in their minds where they're comfortable, where they see the points that you're making, realize that you are, in fact, a credible speaker, you're a balanced speaker. You're not trying to get people to take your word for it. What you're trying to do is to show them what it is that you want them to see and therefore be persuaded by. And the way that you help show them is by a tone, a style of speech which is much more of a teacher as opposed to a debater, much more of a person who's having a conversation with somebody as opposed to a person who is trying to shout down or yell over the top or to orate by force of personality an individual to come your way. So as a preliminary perspective, one of the things to recognize in your public speaking is that your attitude is to have a structured conversation. A conversation that appears to be spontaneous, a conversation that has stopping points for people to think, certainly in an appellate setting for people to ask questions, with a jury for people to chew on your points and to understand your points. And so as a public speaker, you're having a conversation that has a feeling of being spontaneous and at the same time has a tone which is open, unafraid, and takes the time to let the person in on what it is that you have to say. Now, in order to break that preliminary perspective into a series of tips on public speaking, let me take you through the following points. Good public speaking is starting strong. If you lose the audience in the first 10, 15 seconds, well, obviously you're going to be in difficulty. And so part of what good public speaking is to think about, whether it's a direct examination, how it is that I can get launched and get launched in a strong way with interest for the person who is listening in on our conversation. When it's appellate court, it's the statement of an issue that is important issue for the court, one that has meaning. It's the deep issue often, and so starting strong is a mark of good persuasive speaking. I want to give you some tips about speaking in phrases as opposed to whole sentences, and give you some examples of each of those. And so I want to make a comment about that and tell you what that involves. In addition, talk to you about what are the deep issues in the persuasion that you're going to put forward, whether it's in an appellate setting or for a jury in a direct examination. Where are the points of crisis, the points of deep interest for the jury, the points of most disagreement, so that you can take the time to give the best that you can about that topic. I want to talk to you about stance and gestures and make some comments to you about how it is to think about your gestures and how to use your gestures in a way to try to develop a pace and a rhythm that will match the listening needs of your speakers, of your listeners. Talk about having themes and how to weave themes and transitions in times when your overall speech has got a point, a particular point of view that you want to remind and repeat and rephrase almost like a refrain as a piece of music. I want to talk to you about respecting the intelligence of the jury and the intelligence of the court, and give you a couple suggestions about the structure of your rhetoric in order to be able to make sure that you don't end up shouting at the person that you're talking to. And then finally, to talk about a structure for a presentation which you might find useful, whether it's the structure of an expert testimony that you're doing, or a structure of an opening statement that you're making, or a structure of a closing argument that you're making. And then finally, how to use visuals and how to interact with the visuals and how to end strong. Now, in appellate advocacy, there's one more piece, and that is rebuttal. And we'll see if we can give you some suggestions about how to use rebuttal also if there's time for that. So let me just say a few things about starting strong. Imagine what your early impressions would be if I stood up in front of you and I presented something like this. Today my topic for you is, well, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to present some early thoughts on how maybe you could be persuasive, the most persuasive that you could be, and so that's what my topic is today. And you would probably look at me and you would be very worried about whether or not, in fact, I had prepared for the presentation. There's so much stopping and starting that's going on in the beginning of that presentation that there is a real difficulty in trusting that the presentation that I'm going to make to you is going to be well organized. And there are little things that you pick up as an audience that give you an idea of whether or not this person really knows what they're doing, and starting strong is one of them. Now, obviously, you got lots of advice about starting strong. In the appellate context, starting strong really has to do with the context of the court, making sure the court knows that you know who you are, who you represent, and what you want them to do. And similarly, in a presentation with the jury, telling the jury who you are and who you represent and what it is that's the main point of this case, what you want them to do, is going to be crucial to a starting strong. In competition with that kind of a starting strong, which is focused on what it is that your audience wants up front, a sense of where you're going, what the direction is, and context for you as a speaker, there is a different place to start, and it's one where you start with the heart of the issue that's in front of the court. And the persuasive start then often is with a deep issue. I want to talk to you about this difficult issue of speaking well while you're thinking on your feet, and give you a way of organizing yourself, your presentation, and some technique to help you to be your best and authentic self. That is to design, that start is designed to get at what is, you believe, the deepest worry or concern that the audience has, and to frame your speech around that deepest worry or deepest concern, and suggest that in fact you're going to guide them to a place where they don't have to be afraid anymore, and that they're going to see the things and feel comfortable with the way that you're presenting. And I would suggest to you that often in your public speaking, your choices are these two. And sometimes you combine them in some ways, but basically either you're trying to meet the court's concern about who are you and who do you represent and what do you want, or you're trying to frame what you believe is a prepared audience's deepest fear, deepest concern, as an issue that they ought to think about. Now, your theme of your presentation is often related to your deepest issue. And the match between those two is a nice, powerful way to start any kind of public presentation. So, in State versus Mitchell, the case may be, and your beginning statement is, members of the jury, that defendant, Joe Mitchell, did something he had no right to do. He put his gun out the window of his car, and he took away the life of Leslie Mitchell. He took away everything she ever was and everything she ever would be. And the state will present evidence to you that Joe Mitchell, on the night of November the 30th, drove his white Pontiac at about 10 o'clock in the evening. He had been stalking his wife earlier that day. And your start then is a start which addresses what you believe is the deepest issue, the injustice of what it is that's been done. And you know, you're going to hear this again and again, that the prosecutor's job is to help the jury not lose the victim and see the loss of a real human being, not become so analytically involved in the discussion that they create doubt which wouldn't normally be there by being too analytic. And so themes then can be woven into your persuasive start, and it's something to keep an eye on. Your legal theory in a legal setting, in a more tight legal setting, is going to have to be tied to your theme. If you're an appellate court, your beginning cannot get too far away from what the motion is that you're arguing or the appellate issue that's before the court. And so there needs to be a match in order to be able to also give the court comfort that you know what the job of the court is. But these are basically two fundamental places that you start in public speaking as a lawyer when you're trying to start strong. Now, I want to talk to you about this very beginning that I did just a few minutes ago with all the hesitations in it, and talk to you about what Brian Johnson, who is the master in communication, who works with all of the stars, whether that's celebrities or lawyer stars, will talk to you about, which is the paradox of naturalness. You see, there are a number of things that I'm doing right now as I'm talking to you that are not natural. If I was just natural, my voice volume would be much lower. And I would probably be not as careful in the way that I pick my words. And so my voice volume would be down and it wouldn't be carrying the room. In order for me to look natural and to sound natural, I have to have more energy. I have to take a deeper breath. If I don't have more breath and more energy in what it is that I'm saying, then the strange paradox of naturalness is that I don't look natural in my speech if I'm not loud enough. Now this starts right from the get-go on direct examination. If you start out and you say, Your Honor, members of the jury, Mr. Jones, would you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury? If your voice is too low, the jury's reaction is to worry about you, to worry about whether or not, in fact, you know what you're doing. And one of the paradoxes then of naturalness is to make sure that you make them forget about you by speaking louder than is natural so that you appear natural and appear in control. And in a way, what we're talking about then is to speak louder, to have that breath and that volume that allows you to speak louder and carry the room. Now, have you ever been in a public speaking setting that when you stood up that suddenly your mouth got dry? And in addition, what happened is that your voice jumped an octave as you made your opening presentation. And what's going on there is obviously the function of adrenaline that is rolling through you, and also the function of Something that is very common as a matter of public speaking is that before often you stand to speak, you have a tendency to stop breathing. And without that breath support, what happens is that you're using then your voice to project, and without the breath support, there is no power to what it is that you have to say. So, it's a very simple tip. It's a tip that is very often overlooked, whether it's in music or it's in any kind of public speaking, is that before you say to yourself, breathe. And breathe one of those breaths that's through the belly button, to make sure that that volume, that breath support is there in order to be able to carry the first things that you have to say. Not only do you need to speak louder to appear more natural, you also have to keep an eye on standing stiller. Now, let me say just a word about that. I mean, have you seen the professorial strolls, where what you have is you have somebody who is, as they're talking, they're having this conversation. They don't really ever look at you. It feels good to kind of stroll. It works off the energy and the adrenaline that they have. But the movement of the feet then becomes a kind of a little back and forth while they're dealing with that adrenaline to try to release the adrenaline in some way. And at the same time, though, what happens is that they lose the power of what it is that they have to say. And one of the things to notice about the NIDA two-step, we call it the National Institute for Trial Advocacy two-step, is when that adrenaline hits those legs and you start to move, you are literally stepping on your lungs. And so what you need to do is to find a way to stand stiller so that people can focus more on what you have to say, as opposed to noticing all this kind of unconscious bobbing and weaving, almost like a boxer is, to stay out from being hit. And that communicates subtly uncertainty, fear of the audience, and therefore less persuasion as you speak. And what you like to do is to have your toes grab the floor, find a place where you can stand. You see public speakers go through a whole series of gyrations. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll cross their legs. Sometimes what you see somebody do is that they move their hips kind of side to side in a kind of a swaying motion. I know I'm guilty of this all the time. It comes, I think, from rocking my children when when their kids were growing up, is you'd rock a baby and you'd move your hips back and forth, and kind of feels good. It kind of releases the energy. The problem with public speaking is that your audience can get seasick by that continual swaying back and forth. So you want to line your hips up in a way that aligns with your shoulders so that the power and the energy of your speech can be directed to your audience, and the audience then can concentrate on what it is that you have to say. Now, I'm not saying never move in a courtroom. Certainly in a courtroom, moving to get an exhibit, having to admit an exhibit, moving to change the focus of what it is that you want somebody to listen to. Think about this. If I would say, now, let's turn our attention to another area, and I move a couple of steps and I move as a way of helping the audience shift gears. Then those kinds of movements for a purpose, are a persuasive technique, and a technique of public speaking that you can orchestrate. You can almost choreograph where you want to be in relationship to your exhibits and to where it is that you want the witnesses to be looking. But if you take that adrenaline and you let it go into your legs, and you don't control it, then notice that the nervousness that's communicated by the continual movement is that you look nervous and not natural. Whereas the paradox of naturalness is that the stiller you stand, the more natural you appear, and the more comfortable you look, even though this is not natural. Now, notice also the fidget less. You know, if I'm being natural, what I'm doing is I'm stroking my face, I'm pulling the back of my hair, I am fidgeting. I'm making little adjustments as I am talking, because that's naturally what I'm doing. And that movement also helps release a fair amount of energy. But again, the problem with all of those little adjustments is a guy that's a little slick a guy that's doing a little bit of discomfort of adjusting. And so the fidgeting is something to keep an eye on. What am I doing with my hands? Am I doing strange things as I'm moving my hands in my pockets and adjusting myself and pulling on my belt and scratching my nose and scratching the back of my head? And one of the things then is to keep an eye on what it is that you're doing with your gestures and to control those gestures in a way that shows less nervousness or fidgeting. Now let me say just another word about that fidget less here, because it raises the question of gesturing and it raises the questions of gestures, and I want to just go through a kind of a real quick set of do's and don'ts. Now, you will hear it is the advice of a trial lawyer who was advised by other trial lawyers who were told that speaking with your hands is often distracting. You know, the national characteristic of Italians presumably is that there's distractions from speaking with your hands. You're too passionate. You need to control your hands. Well, let me tell you, nonsense. That in fact, that advice is advice that does not really understand what a good public speaker is doing. You watch today. Watch on the news. You watch of commentators. You watch good public speaking. You watch Obama, Bill Clintons of the world. You watch our public politicians, and what you'll see is that their gestures are very important to the word emphasis that they're using as they speak. And in fact, communication specialists tell us that the gestures often help you become more articulate. They pull from your brain the right word at the right time. And if you tie your gestures down, and if you become stiff and planted with your gestures, that what happens is that your body will communicate that desire to gesture, to help out with little fidgets and moves. And those fidgets and moves, again, will communicate a sense of discomfort, where your gestures, which help pull out the right words, can often, in fact, make you more articulate. And there is this curious paradox that people will not be watching your gestures. I'll have to point out gestures to you as you speak. That in fact people focus on the face, that the gestures are really for you. They will help you be your most persuasive. And so when I say fidget less, I would encourage you to gesture, to let your gestures live large and last long as a way of highlighting and in fact facilitating your word choices. Choices that will be pulled out from you, that will be much clearer and better if you go ahead and let yourself gesture. It'll give the release for the energy of the adrenaline. It'll allow you to then to stay planted, but at the same time release that energy. And there's one little refinement that I want to point out to you. If I in fact do gesture, and if my gestures are small and repetitive gestures, and what that happens is that I am not controlling those gestures in any way, and that they're just becoming little nervous reactions over and over and over again, then the advice about gestures being distracting is exactly right. But if the gestures, open and large, show an openness to the communication and conversation, and naturally flow in a smooth presentation, almost like a ballet dancer opening up and presenting before you get started, that those gestures, in fact, will aid your word choice, your facility with the language, and also communicate in a paradox of unnaturalness, that you don't usually gesture this large and this big, but what's communicated is a sense of confidence and ownership of the space that's really crucial to good public speaking. So try this. I know there's resistance to this out there in the world, but my suggestion to you is to give a good try at these gestures. You'll find that those gestures, in fact, help you communicate. There are subtle things that you do with your hands, your presentations. You help point out how things progress. Your body and your gestures can help turn you into a visual aid to aid the understanding, and you'll do that all naturally. You'll do it naturally if you open yourself up and give yourself a chance. So fidgeting, put away the fidgeting, but certainly open up the gestures. Let me say a quick word about the pace of your speech. Now remember back to the beginning here as I started this presentation. I started it and I stopped it. You could hear it. What I'm going to do is I'd like to spend the time trying to give you some tips, maybe suggestions about ways that it is that you can improve your persuasiveness as a public speaker. And you'll see that what happens when I start speaking is that I'm starting and stopping, and the pace of my speech is filled with little thinking noises as I'm trying to pick the right words. Instead, in the paradox of unnaturalness, it is to speak in phrases, not whole sentences. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is to chunk your ideas and not try to rush all the way through to the end of the sentence, but to try to develop a stopping point where you stop and let the listener catch up to what it is that you have to say. So practice out loud to try to hit that pace that allows you the comfort of stopping and selecting the right words. This is especially important for beginnings. It's especially important as you present your strongest ideas. If you speak too fast, and if you start and stop as you're trying to present your ideas, what's communicated is a lot of these thinking noises that again shows naturalness. And I'm not advising simply to speak slower and slow down. What I am giving you as advice is to speak in phrases, not whole sentences, in order to be able to set the metronome at the right pace and give your listener the chance to exercise their echoic memory and to track what it is that you have to say. Now, when you stand to public speak, one of the things to do is then to use these above tips to manage that adrenaline. Because there's no doubt about it, when you stand for public speaking, the adrenaline is pumping. After all, there are a lot of large human beings out there in front of you, and there is a flight or fight syndrome that you're dealing with whenever you engage in public speaking. It's why it's fearful to a lot of folks to do public speaking. And my suggestion to you is then that as you're thinking about your public speaking, one of the ways to manage that adrenaline is to remember to breathe, is to set your feet in a little mantra of getting ready thoughts. Make sure you set your feet. Make sure you release your gestures. Pick a metronome for the beginning of your speech that allows you to speak in phrases and not whole sentences. And keep an eye on that pace. Probably the most important thing I have to offer to you is by setting that pace, that metronome, at a pace which allows you to select your words, you'll find that you'll become yourself, that you will in a sense lose the public speaking concerns quite quickly as your gestures help you pull out your right words and you become your most articulate self. Now I'm going to stop here for now. This is some ideas for you as to how it is to start to think about your public speaking, and we'll come back at another time and give you some more suggestions as to how it is that you might think about things like openings and closings and directs and crosses. Thank you.